There were no women editors of Shakespeare until the 19th century, and even those editors were not considered Shakespearean editors, even up until the late 20th century, so within our lifetimes, because they edited Shakespeare for children. So who gets to say what Shakespeare is has been contested even at the most foundational level of what texts we're reading. Nahum Tate is a famous Shakespearean editor who rewrote the ending of King Lear because he thought it was just too difficult for it's too sad for his audiences to handle. And that was the King Lear that was played for about 100 years that everybody knew as Shakespeare's King Lear.
Welcome, 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 welcome. Welcome to The Point. Across 4 centuries, Shakespeare's plays have repeatedly functioned as a kind of political and cultural infrastructure. Portable scripts with enormous symbolic capital that can be mobilized to legitimize authority, contest authority, or reframe collective identity. So let's go back to 1776 and set that stage. Shakespeare was already part of the political language of the Atlantic world. American colonists parodied Hamlet in debates about taxation, and figures like George Washington and Abigail Adams quoted Shakespeare in their correspondence as they grappled with questions about leadership, legitimacy, and rebellion. And at the same time, interestingly, theater itself was contested. The Continental Congress discouraged theatrical entertainments in 1774, worried about their social influence. Yet in the decades after the Revolution, playgoing and Shakespeare performance expanded rapidly in the New Republic. Part of Shakespeare's political durability comes from the plays themselves, which repeatedly stage crises of sovereignty, crowd behavior, demagoguery, and the ethics of overthrow. But part of it is infrastructural. The publication of the first folio in 1623 helped stabilize Shakespeare as a cultural authority whose words could be quoted, taught, and repurposed across centuries. In that sense, what we can often call political Shakespeare today is less a modern invention than a recurring activation of pressures that were already there in the early modern stage. But Shakespeare's durability is also institutional. Over time, Shakespeare has come to operate as a credential, a cultural shield, an amplifier. Institutions can claim they're simply presenting a classic, even while choices of casting, cutting, setting, and publicity steer interpretation. And artists and communities working under constraint have often used that same classic as a cover, code, or shared language. When we look across history, the mechanisms are consistent. Adaptation, casting and embodiment, staging as political analogy, paratext like programs and publicity, translation, and curricular canon building. In his book, Becoming Shakespeare, Jack Lynch observes that people on different sides of history have tended to believe that God and Shakespeare are on their side. So tonight, we are here not asking whether Shakespeare causes political change. We're asking something both more subtle and perhaps more enduring. How and why does Shakespeare keep becoming useful in moments when power is being contested on stage, in institutions, and in the public imagination? To help us explore that idea, I am so absolutely delighted to introduce four, yes, four, because we need four people to help us dive into this, incredible panelists. So first, I have Erica Beckler sitting on the far end. She's an associate professor at Northeastern University. Her interdisciplinary research spans Shakespeare, early modern poetry, book history, and print culture. She's the author of Playful Letters, a study in early modern alphabetics, and is currently completing a book that uses pre-modern critical race theory to examine how racial discourse is embedded in the foundations of European printing and literary culture. And then I have next to Erica, I have Adele Lee, who is our own Emersonian on the panel tonight. She is an associate professor of Emerson, of early modern literature at Emerson College. Her research focuses on global Shakespeare, cross-cultural encounters, and accent and sound in early modern literature. She is the author of The English Renaissance and the Far East, editor of Shakespeare and Accentism, and the co-author of Shakespeare in East Asian Education. And then next to Adele, we are so lucky to have Carla Delegata, who is here all the way from DC, an associate professor of theater scholarship and performance studies at the University of Maryland and head of its MA PhD program. Her work focuses on Shakespearean adaptation, bilingual theater, and Latinx performance. She is the co-editor of Shakespeare and the Latinidad and the author of Latinx Shakespeare's Staging U.S. Intercultural Theater, and serves in leadership roles with the Latinx Theater Commons and Shakespeare and Social Justice. And then right next to me, I have Christine Hamill, who is an associate professor of voice and acting at Boston University School of Theater, my alma mater. An actor, director, and voice specialist, her research explores the politics of voice, emotion, and embodiment in Shakespeare and performance. She is the founder of Femina Shakes Initiative and the co-author with Anne J. Cahill of Sounding Bodies, Identity, Injustice, and the Voice. And this is all to say these are very short forms of their very long bios. They are all incredible people, and you should Google them and follow them and read all of their things. So, to kick us off, Shakespeare is often treated as timeless, but as this program suggests, he's also politically useful. So, to get us acquainted with your own experiences with Shakespeare, when did it first click for you that these plays weren't just literary artifacts, but tools that people actively use to think about power, authority, or resistance? Started off light.
Okay. Hello. Hi, I'm Carla. It first occurred to me when I was in honors drama as a freshman in high school, and we performed some scenes. Each year, the drama festival would pick a comedy and a tragedy. I was in, of course, group Serious, which was the tragedy group because I looked too serious and never got to be in a comedy role my 4 years of high school. And I had to play Tybalt because I was taller than all the boys. And we went to the drama festival, and you get to see all of these other high schools performing scenes from the same play and using them completely differently. These were all people my age. They were 14, and their high school teacher or the seniors directing them had interpreted the same scenes, the same play in fundamentally different ways. And that itself was an education. And I thought our interpretation was a little dull, and we didn't make the finals. And so, so I realized that there were fundamentally different ways of interpreting the same text, and I learned that more in the theater than I had been learning it in my honors English class at the same time. And that was where I first encountered that.
It's amazing.
I could jump in. Yeah. I don't know if there's a single moment when it clicked, but there was a moment that altered my life, if you will. I was in college. I was writing my thesis on Shakespeare, and I had gone to see Ian McKellen's Richard III, which, if you know that movie, it's a Hitler-style Richard III, and it was really disturbing. But when I came out of the theater and was walking back to my apartment, there was a block party that had gone rogue, and a car had been set on fire, and people were lobbing like flaming things in the streets. The police had showed up. This was Madison, Wisconsin, the site of Vietnam protests. A building had been blown up during those protests. So it's traditionally a site where revolutionary violence occurs, although I don't think this was revolutionary violence that had gotten out of control. But I felt like I had stepped out of the theater into the movie because the Richard III version was set during World War II, or a World War II-like setting. And the line between Shakespeare and my life felt very thin at that moment. And it really changed the way I thought about Shakespeare and what Shakespeare can do and how I can use it to kind of interpret what's going on around me and the politics of what's going on around me.
Wow. It is so powerful.
I'm happy to jump in. I'm Christine. I use she, her pronouns. I grew up performing a lot, and I really enjoyed performing Shakespeare. I thought it was an interesting challenge. And I was an English major in college, so I did a lot of analysis of Shakespeare through the lens of like psychoanalytics and all kinds of things. But it really wasn't until I was in my late 20s and I was cast as Hermione in The Winter's Tale, and I had just started to engage with the work of Tina Packer, the late Tina Packer, and Kristen Linklater, and their approach to Shakespeare, which was really embodied. That suddenly, I remember in the middle of a performance feeling this profound force of these words that seemed to open up something in myself I did not know I had access to. Feelings that maybe I had felt, as a teenager or as a toddler, but finding a place to center them, in a public space and having these words to speak parts of myself that had been in hiding was incredibly powerful. And that feels, to me, at the root of some of the political power of Shakespeare is simply in the the embodied truth through the voice, and that opened up a whole journey from there.
Adele?
Well, for me, growing up in Northern Ireland, in Belfast during the Troubles, just to study Shakespeare was a political choice. I mean, it was a political statement. You were aligning yourself with the British establishment. I mean, it was mostly Protestant students would be taking those electives. So I never encountered Shakespeare just as a poet, as a playwright. It was always this contested site. And if you weren't aligning yourself with Shakespeare in a way that was kind of like showing allegiance to the crown, you were doing the opposite, which was also happening at Queen's University, where people were very much, very invested in sort of post-colonial approaches to Shakespeare and using Shakespeare to talk back. And it was loaded, it was a loaded site.
Yeah. What was, if you weren't I'm going off script. If you weren't aligning yourself, what would an alternative be?
Well, you did Irish drama.
Just full Irish drama. Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you all for those varied and thoughtful and fascinating answers. So to get us into the core of our conversation, many people will associate Shakespeare with the monarchy or the cultural establishment. And yet across history, his plays keep getting taken up by movements for change. For example, we know Shakespeare was already circulating in politicized language during the Revolution, as we had said previously. So what is it about the plays, right? Their treatment of revolt, the legitimacy, human ambition, that you feel makes them so reusable in moments of political tension? I'm looking a little at Adele because we talked about this on our call yesterday.
I can't remember what I said then, but it was quite good. It was quite a good
really
response there. I
smart
can't
what you did
remember now. I mean, I don't think Shakespeare rises in prominence during times of crisis. I think he's always around, right? I mean, are there moments when
I think how do you feel?
the approach maybe changes?
Yeah, the approach might be changing, but when we talk about the actual treatment in his plays of revolt and examining the treatment of revolt and revolution and legitimacy, how does that correlate with contemporary experiences, do you feel, or experiences throughout history?
I mean, Shakespeare's plays are full of rebels.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the plays deal with some form of revolt, personal or political. And, you have very overtly political plays like Richard II, like Coriolanus, like Julius Caesar, right, where you have actual usurpations and the fallout therefrom. But, I mean, I think a lot of rebels are romanticized in the play. I mean, your Hotspurs and your Jack Cades and all the rest of it. But they're always defeated. Right, order's always restored. I mean, there are attempts, right? There's always this pattern, right, in Shakespeare of, subversion, right, and containment. So, as much as these plays are rising and romanticize the rioters, and they also show them vanquished at the end, right? The establishment always prevails, right?
I think there's a bit of a correlation too, right, throughout history in terms of romanticizing our own narrative of national heroes, right? That we
Yes.
see, right? And the establishment is the one who's writing the story, right? Whatever establishment we're living in now, and we kind of see that parallel. Carla, do you have any? I remember from yesterday we had talked a little bit about this from my notes.
Well, from a theater perspective, purely practical, he's free and in the public domain. And so you can stage his plays and you can do whatever you want with them. And so especially during times of tension, people like to go back to familiar stories. And the statistics from what people were watching during COVID lockdown show that people went back to things they had already seen in familiar narratives. But part of the pleasure that we get is the slight adjustment in every time we see something, of noticing something new or a different interpretation. When it comes to moments of like heightened political tension, one of the things that Shakespeare does incredibly well is that he gives voice to a whole range of characters. And when Iago walks down stage and says, "I hate the Moor," he's letting people in. But Othello also lets people in through monologue and soliloquy and certain characters with asides. Shylock does that with asides, but Portia has an aside too. So who are we really identifying with? We're not meant to identify with any one particular person, which that capaciousness allows all sorts of moments of I'm on this side, I'm the rebel, no, I am the establishment, and everyone kind of can interpret from there or stage it however they want. I think also as well that when you're really passionate about something, when you're fighting for your ideals, aren't they beautifully expressed through one of the best poets that we have? You're like, oh, he said it better than I could. And if I can find it in poetry, then maybe there's some enduring truth about it.
I love that you are getting right into my next question so incredibly seamlessly, which is, what is it about those plays that makes them so adaptable across time and place? It's almost like we had a meeting about this beforehand. You just mentioned the language, the characters. Adele, I think yesterday you had mentioned, it's the plots, it's connecting to the people in them. I think we had said the gappiness of the text.
And the gappiness, that term comes from Paula Vogel, playwright Paula Vogel, who's also Dr. Paula Vogel, who talks about 6 different types of dramatic structure. One of them, what we see in a lot of Greek plays, which is linear, go forward. She describes epic narrative structure as linear with pauses or linear with gaps. And so like Shakespearean drama, where the action is go forward, and then there might be monologues or soliloquies that stop that. Scholar Emma Smith actually wrote a whole book on the gappiness of Shakespearean language. And it's those pauses and openings and the stopping of action that, and also the openness of poetry that we're getting at with that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I mean, the texts are, so malleable, so open-ended, so ideologically mixed. I mean, that's why Shakespeare is sort of endlessly adaptable, and he can be enlisted in any cause, right? He can serve any agenda. He can be forced into, he can be, shoehorned, right? To validate anybody's argument or viewpoint, right? And that's.
Yeah, Erica.
I'm going to take a different tack here with
Yes,
this
please.
question and posit that his adaptability is the effect of empire and the ways in which Shakespearean plays have been recruited for imperial purposes, British imperial purposes, to the point where they seem universal, that the British standard is the universal standard, the white upper class man and ideals are quote unquote universal ideals. And we see ways in which the empire also always includes the seeds for its own destruction within it. And I think that's also a strategy because it needs to contain those seeds. And I think that the adaptability involves picking out those seeds and speaking back to the empire through Shakespeare. And I wonder if we would, be saying the same thing, say if the Soviet Union had succeeded in taking over greater territory, would we all be reading Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and saying, okay, they're right, infinitely adaptable? Or I think about the great Indian epic, the Ramayana, and the ways in which half the world is reading and adapting the Ramayana. that kind of cultural imperialism that happens and ways in which cultures negotiate their relationship to in cultural imperialism or military and economic imperialism.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. I think that's a really important framework, especially when we're talking about setting something within the American Revolution and a response. What is revolution? What is the response to the British Empire? Are we that different from the thing we're pushing back upon? How have we done so far? Christine, I know.
I was going to say something a little different, a little bit more from the performance perspective, I think, but that all of these characters, I think they have multiple entry points for understanding. They're really complex. They're often grappling between two opposing ideas or forces and living at the intersection of the psychological and the political and the philosophical, and that there's a real effort on the part of all of the characters to create meaning actively and to understand themselves. And I think that really does yield up so many ways that there could be investigations of self and self-actualization that could be useful from a variety of political standpoints.
Yeah. So I think we're on to something here, which is related to the next question with kind of what you're saying. Your work focuses on the politics of voice. What can Shakespeare teach us about, you used the phrase before, the embodied voice, as a form of political expression, especially especially in moments of when speaking, just the act of speaking itself becomes an act of power or empowerment?
Well, I think that can show up in a couple of ways. So one of them is what it feels and looks like for people who have been traditionally excluded from the Shakespearean stage to step into characters that have a lot of power. And that's certainly something I investigated with my students at Boston University, working with young actors who were female, cis, trans, non-binary actors, gender diverse actors, who were stepping into typically masculine roles and beginning to feel the power of what it was to be able to have a captive audience, to center themselves in a space, to speak really powerful words, to almost use the argument and the rhetoric of this text as a wedding stone for intellectual sharpness, in a way that they simply maybe hadn't practiced very much in their lives, and how doing that was extremely empowering. I would get reports that they would feel that they were, 2 feet taller, and that they, really had almost like a physical, alteration. And I think there's also something too about speaking in powerful ways that is not just about translating what's, within into a public space, but also hearing oneself do that and knowing that there's the possibility of actually influencing others' hearts and minds and receiving that. And that is kind of a feedback loop that can grow in itself. And I also think we can look, to his later plays in particular, when Shakespeare really did seem to get interested in historically marginalized people, or people who had been oppressed in various ways. Women speaking to power. I think of Paulina in The Winter's Tale, Ariel, the enslaved spirit, speaking their truth to power, Caliban, and that he seemed to really find a rhetorical space for those characters who didn't have a voice to have a voice, and change the events and shape the action of the play. And I think those are speeches that are well worth taking on and listening to very seriously.
Yeah. I just want to give anybody a chance to respond to that if you have thoughts about that as well.
I have a couple of thoughts. You're just sort of highlighting the extent to which Shakespeare was already invested in marginalized groups. So it's only makes sense, 400 years later, that marginalized groups would find Shakespeare to be a resource that was empowering. But there's also something problematic about the fact that when you speak Shakespeare, right, some of that majesty that sort of rubs off on you, that gravitas, and it's, when you think about what he embodies, what he's symbolizes. Shakespeare was close to being cancelled a few years ago, remember, precisely because of, what he was thought to symbolize, to represent, namely, Britain, white imperialism. But for a marginalized group then to use Shakespeare's lines to feel 2 feet taller. I mean, there is something. It's kind of similar to a woman putting on, donning male disguise in a Shakespeare play, right? You're still relying on the patriarchy. You're still relying, for self empowerment.
Yeah, I want to. So I'm going to skip ahead in my questions. I had framed this maybe more of a timeline structure, but because I think this theme is so important to deep dive and we're on to something great here, I'm going to skip ahead to a question, then I'll take us back in time, which is that we see Shakespeare travel into very different political contexts. So on Robben Island in the 1970s, there was a single volume of Shakespeare that circulated among anti-apartheid prisoners, and Nelson Mandela famously signed the book at Julius Caesar. In that setting, Shakespeare becomes a shared language of endurance and political imagination. And exactly as we're kind of getting into with your work, Christine, and your notes there, Adele, in that artists, throughout time, artists and communities that have been excluded from traditional power structures have repeatedly returned to Shakespeare. So, right, mining exactly what you're saying. What are we finding in these plays? What are these groups finding in these plays, whether it's, right, the language, the character, the structure, that still offers or models for resistance and recognition there? So, just zooming out and focusing on what you're saying a little bit more. I think it's so valuable.
I'm just thinking about Nelson Mandela and his love of The Merchant of Venice, right? And Hath Not a Jew Eyes. Wasn't that his fear? I mean, he was heavily annotated. But maybe somebody else wants.
Well, I think I'm a theater person at heart, and I'm always like, let's talk about the practicality of this. Some of it has to do with, in the United States, more than 90% of high school freshmen are assigned Romeo and Juliet. And I'm a product of public education in the state of California until I went to my PhD program in a different state. And I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, the original University of California. I took a class, I'm Latina, and I took a class on Hispanic theater, as it was called back in the 1990s. And we didn't read anything written after 1850. It is more likely that you will get Shakespeare in your secondary or higher education than it is to get literature of your community. So part of it is familiarity, is about saying the way this was likely taught to you, was taught to a lot of people, including me, in a particular way, and doing something quite different than that with it. I think there's also something to be said for the fact that this is dramatic literature and that we see it actioned on stage. And part of the coloniality and the empire is what now feeds into ubiquity. And I think my first encounter with Shakespeare is one of two things. One was Sesame Street, when the Count was singing, or actually it was out of someone, it was to be or not to be, and there was the letter B, and there was like, and the B would disappear and come back. Or it was a Scooby-Doo cartoon where they ran into the castle and they were chasing the ghost of Omelette. And my mother said, "You mean Hamlet?" I said, "No, Mom, it's Omelette." And I had no idea that I was engaging with Shakespeare. But these stories start to become familiar, and they're familiar over time. And then you're like, I want to play with them. And that's one of the things that I always remember about playwrights, is that play is part of that. And that I'm part of the Latinx Theater Commons, and I've dramaturged shows at different theaters and consulted on bilingual theater and so forth. And sometimes there's a real political stance that people are trying to make. And sometimes it's just like, we want to be included and we just want to put on the show. Like, why does it have to have a political stance? Maybe we can just put on a show and it doesn't have to have a social justice component. I say that as someone who works in social justice theater, but it's equally important to remember that sometimes that heading can do a disservice to the aesthetics and artistry of people who just want to be considered as Shakespearean actors and directors. And so I think that in itself, like brown bodies on stage, people with accents that are not typical American accents. We all have an accent, right? Like, performing these lines is a political act in itself. And and the explicit, it has to be subversive, sometimes works as a dramaturgical construct, but even if that's not the case, like, I remember the first time, some of the first times I saw certain bodies on stage that didn't look like what I expected them to be. And I remember the comments from other people. They're like, oh, he was a bit urban, code for something else, right? Or not even coded. And I found it exciting, I'm like, ooh, this is really neat. Look more like the people I grew up with, right? And anyway, I think I think that subversion acts in a bunch of different forms. And it can work in a nuanced way in the theater and an overt way as well.
Erica, I'm wondering if this intersects with your work at all, or if you have thoughts on this.
Well, I did want to talk about the book historical reception of Shakespeare over time. If Shakespeare's plays hadn't been printed, we wouldn't have them. And who controls what is printed has been a site of much controversy over the centuries. There were no women editors of Shakespeare until the 19th century, and even those editors were not considered Shakespearean editors, even up until the late 20th century, so within our lifetimes, because they edited Shakespeare for children. So who gets to say what Shakespeare is has been contested even at the most foundational level of what texts we're reading. Nahum Tate is a famous Shakespearean editor who rewrote the ending of King Lear because he thought it was just too difficult for it's too sad for his audiences to handle. And that was the King Lear that was played for about 100 years that everybody knew as Shakespeare's King Lear. Editing makes a big difference. If you're reading these texts in school or even for private pleasure, you typically need footnotes and annotations to understand Shakespearean language, right? Even I need those footnotes and rely on those footnotes as a scholar. And who decides what to footnote and how to make those annotations? We see very sexist footnotes. We see racist footnotes. We see the decisions not to gloss female experiences in historical editions. So thinking about who controls the text and who controls how you encounter the text has been a part of Shakespearean reception, an important part of Shakespearean reception that's often overlooked.
That is so fascinating, the marginalization within the physical printed text.
Yes.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much for this. Carla, I want to dive into something kind of the opposite of what you had just noted, which is that we can consider Shakespeare that it functions as what one might call an elastic alibi, because it circulates as high culture. Institutions and artists alike can claim they're simply presenting a classic, like we said at the beginning, even when the performance choices themselves are doing quite pointed political work. So as such, many of Shakespeare's most political moments emerge through staging and performance choices, not just the text itself. So I think this is kind of the reverse of what you're saying is, sometimes we simply want to be the Shakespearean actors on stage. But what happens when directorial choices, design choices, or vocal approach significantly shifts the political meaning of a production? And I'm wondering if you have some experience seeing some shows where you thought, oh, this is that, or are able to pull from history some moments when there was something that stuck with you with a pointed political meaning with Shakespeare that was not expected or surprising.
It's like the story of my life. A few things. Well, a number. I'll try to be concise. I saw a Taiwanese all-female version of The Merchant of Venice called Bond. and the actors or actresses, I had kind of these moments of translation, which I deal with a great deal. They're singing, it's opera, and in a language that I don't understand. And then the captions over there were like, you know, Antonio was sad. I'm like, okay, a lot more just happened on stage than it, but I know the play quite well. In the Q&A afterwards, someone asked, if you're familiar with the play, Portia disguises herself as a lawyer, as the judge, and delivers the quality of mercy speech in the courtroom, and is in disguise, and only later reveals to her husband Bassanio, hey, that was me, right? And so in this production, Portia wasn't disguised. And someone asked, well, that's a really big change. And then the translator interpreted, and all the actors whispered to each other, and they came back with, well, of course Bassanio would recognize his wife. And I'm like, and it wasn't even that, yes, we made this great change from Shakespeare's play. It's crucial to the lines that follow and everything that happens in the courtroom. It was just like, whatever. And I'm like, yeah, he should recognize his wife. Yeah, and I realized kind of this I don't know, this notion of course married people should recognize each other, wig or not. And I'm like, yeah. And I don't know, it made me feel like all the productions I'd seen before then were ridiculous. And in a very kind of different example, saw a production at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival of Hamlet, directed by Bill Rausch, where Dan Donahoe played the lead role. And the Get Thee to a Nunnery scene, in which Hamlet is yelling pretty much at Ophelia, can be played a whole bunch of different ways. And, is he sad? Does he mean it? What, who's eavesdropping and so forth? It was a contemporary production. So Polonius and the King, it was went into kind of a sound booth, and they had all these expensive cameras all over, they were watching in the castle. And Ophelia kind of starts this scene, and she lifts up her shirt to reveal that she's wearing tape recordings. And Hamlet sees it, and she looks, and they both cry, and they're kissing, right? So you can watch Polonius and Claudius hearing the truth of what's happening. And you know that these two people are in love, and everything they're saying to each other is a performance, because it's there to catch Hamlet saying something. And it was very romantic, and I never thought of that scene as romantic, right? How could you make that scene romantic? And I learned something from it. But it also sheds some light on the truth of what we think we know. Polonius and Claudius knew the truth because they had heard it in the recording, and the audience is watching something different than they're hearing, and the sound of the words was disjunctive from the visual of the emotion between the actors. And that in itself, to me, was a way of shifting the politics of the play and
Yeah.
subverting most all the other productions I've ever seen and how they interpret that. And it made quite an impact on me.
Wow. Anyone else have a?
Yeah, I have one production I'd like to mention is the Phillida Lloyd production of the Donmar Warehouse production of Julius Caesar that happened in around 2012 with Harriet Walter as Brutus, and it was set in a women's prison. It was an all-female, probably gender diverse, multicultural cast, and the one notable thing about it, the main thing was just seeing in different bodies the relief of being able to identify the arbitrariness of male power, the sort of grotesqueness of male postures towards power, and how it's very, very much a performable thing. And I thought that was fascinating to see that it really challenged the notion of essentialism around where power resides, and that it was something that this cast could step into in a really significant way.
I also thought that was a great production. Adele, Erica, do you have things that come to mind? Or it's okay if not, no
Well,
pressure.
we were actually just discussing this question in the green room. Then this is the most difficult one to address, because there's so many productions and they're all doing something different. But one thing I've noticed is that a production can try too hard, right? I think the Shakespeare in the Park, Julius Caesar, a few years ago, that was so overtly political, it was bad theater ultimately. But and you don't need to make changes that are that in your face. They can be subtle. I mean, just today, one of my students, three of my students actually, were giving a presentation on Comedy of Errors, and it was an RSC production that was during COVID, during the lockdown. It was an outdoor production, and one of the actors playing Adriana was pregnant, and this turned into like a 30-minute discussion about the significance of this and how it changed their whole reading of the dynamic between Adriana and her husband, and why she was so hysterical. Like her hormones were explaining her demanding to get home for dinner. So it was just, and that was, I mean, that wasn't even intentional, right? That wasn't a deliberate directorial decision. She just happened to get pregnant, and it changed the whole meeting. And now productions since then, have Adriana, the character, wearing, a pad, looking like she's pregnant. It's become part of the new meaning and adaptation of that play.
That is fascinating. Erica?
I can talk about a production, and actually it's the reception that got me. So I show in my introduction to Shakespeare class a scene of of Shylock's "I am a Jew" speech, and that is performed also by prisoners, set in a high security prison in California, and the actor, the prisoner playing Shylock, is Black, and the Solario and Solanio, his two interlocutors, are white, wearing cowboy hats. The scene is the chapel in the prison. It's the actual chapel. The audience is all white, and Shylock, the actor, plays him in a very melodramatic way. He's breaking down. He's hunched over. He's really mourning the loss of his daughter that prompts him to speak that speech. And the entire white audience is laughing. And when I showed it in class, my students laughed with the white audience. And it really bothered me because the audience, watching the audience react to the play, had them reacting, taught them to react a particular way. And I couldn't teach that scene anymore without talking about reaction. And when I've taught it, since I've taught that scene, I always mention what happened the first time I taught it, not to shame those students, but to think about the ways in which being in an audience affects the way that you respond. And we get even Shakespeare thinking about that, right? If we think about Hamlet and the play within a play and how he's telling the other characters how to respond to the play, or suggesting, prompting particular responses.
Yeah. I'd love to deep dive on one of the themes that you're picking up on, which is like the values based, right? What does the play tell us about ourselves? So as we said at the beginning, during the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress had actually discouraged theatrical performance out of concern for its social influence, but the play going surged in the early Republic. So what does that tension, which is kind of a timeless tension, right, suggest about theater as a space where societies come together to rehearse political values or even re-story patriotic, right, narratives? And how might that resonate or not with contemporary performance culture today? How do we also see that tension come up from street theater? In our last point conversation, we talked a lot about performance street theater to blockbusters like Hamilton. What do these shows show us, these performances show us about social influence, about that tension of what could happen, what we think should happen?
You know, this question is interesting because I feel like theater right now has just become this kind of surface upon which there are certain kind of politics being played out. in our country, you know, that maybe don't even necessarily have a whole lot to do with the content of the theater. I'm just thinking about all of the drama around the Kennedy Center and shows that were canceled, and sort of a culture of fear around, you know, the social or political impact of those shows. But really, maybe it's more about, you know, the politics of having control over a public facing artistic institution. And that seems to be a little more of like the in some ways the conversation, the political conversation around theater. And I'm also really curious about this thing that sort of happened recently. I don't know if you've all been aware of this sort of political put down that the idea that someone's called a theater kid. Have you heard about this? It's another word for snowflake, essentially, that, you know, Mamdani was referred to as a theater kid. There's this blog called MAGA versus the Theater Kids. And I think it's this fascinating phenomenon, which I don't know if it's an indictment of empathy. I don't think that's it. I think it's more an indictment of performativity. So I'm really curious about, you know, sort of this indication of this sort of political distrust of performance, period, of theatrical performance, of artistic performance, which is, to me, often, you know, actually sort of feels like we're back in ancient Greece. You know, it's Plato saying we should not trust illusion, you know. So anyway, I feel like there's this meta conversation
Yeah.
that is important to have about.
Right. And a lot of the young activists who survived the Parkland shooting were theater kids, because the theater kids are going to take action and are comfortable, oftentimes are comfortable with public speaking and being out and in front of people. And I do think that's part of it. And when I was thinking about your question, I was thinking a lot about, I teach LGBTQ theater. I've created classes on it at 3 different universities. It's actually the class I've taught most of my career. And I do an entire unit on AIDS plays, because a lot of my students certainly don't get that education in their high school. Neither did I, or at any point in my education. So Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart comes out in 1985, and he's writing history as it's happening. That play is set in the year or two in that time in which it comes out. And the original production had LED, remember LED? Had the LED kind of ribbon going around the theater that would update with how many people had died of AIDS. As the audience was there in the theater watching this story go on, that thing was ticking and updating, right? And every night, the numbers would be higher and higher. And Kramer wrote it as a type of agitprop theater, which means agitation propaganda. And it was meant to get people to want to take action. He was the founder of ACT UP, where a lot of performance art, if you will, in the street that was meant to draw awareness and did that. Then you get plays like Angels in America that come out in 91, 92, which is still the height of the AIDS epidemic, but there's more information and that's if Angels in America, how wonderful, right? I love these plays. But it's not meant to incite in the same way, and it draws out fundamentally different emotions. Now we have Matthew Lopez's Inheritance, which is kind of almost inspired by Howard's End, but is taking up the whole longevity of predominantly gay men who have survived this, and people who didn't think they were going to have a future have lived, some of them, too few of them, into their 50s and 60s and so forth. And that type of theater is a little bit more, you know, reflecting in a different way. So there's a number of different types of political theater, right? And I think that they're all useful and they can all be entertaining. And I think sometimes today, I'm not sure everyone's aware of what are we going to the theater for, right? And I enjoy all of this. It's my career and my livelihood, but I also enjoy cat videos, you know, on YouTube, and that's okay too. And sometimes that's all I can handle after a long day or certain events of the week that have occurred. And I want to be taken away from the reality of the world and not go and sit down at night for 3 hours to be brought back into it, you know? And I think that's where audiences can be upset, because when it comes to intimacy direction, we draw a difference between a trigger and an emotional response. A trigger is defined as something that you might see performed that triggers an experience you've had, right? An emotional response is something that you haven't related to. So that may cause you to cry and whatever response you're having. And I find that a lot of my students don't really distinguish between those and will take action by leaving when they're uncomfortable, rightfully so, but also maybe are not staying with the story through to its end. And so I struggle a bit with that today.
I want to make sure that we deep dive into this, and I'm pivoting a little bit. Erica, back to something that you brought up, I think 2 questions ago. Looking back on the canon, so we're talking Shakespeare's power, right, doesn't travel just through the performance. It travels through institutions, through print, curriculum, as we've noted. It's in many curriculums, commemoration, the archives. And so if we're not just tracing what Shakespeare wrote, but how he became culturally authoritative, especially in 18th and 19th centuries as print culture expanded, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about your research of the material history of printing that helped shape which voices were elevated. And I know we talked a little bit about this in terms of, the British Empire, but how does looking at Shakespeare through that material lens change the story we tell about who the canon was built to serve and who was left on the margins, and who do we think is still left on the margins today?
Oh, that's such a big question.
I know, they're all big ones. I know, I'm mindful of our time.
I think I'd start by saying what's collected first in the archive is important. What is archived? What responses are archived? Where those responses are located and who has access to them is important. If you've been to how many of you have been to a rare book room before and looked at, oh my gosh, that's exciting. Okay, this is a unique audience, right? When you go into the rare book room, a lot of the, it's often difficult to get in. There's all kinds of protocols, right? There's the access to those original documents is challenging. So you've already gone past this first barrier to kind of access, in some ways, the naked text. And once you're confronted with that naked text, it's not like, in some ways, like all those paratexts drop away. And you have this kind of personal experience that allows you to see the ways in which your experience of the text has been shaped or contoured in ways outside of your control. So I don't know if that's exactly where you were going with that question, but I'm an archival scholar and I bring my students in and their minds are blown when they see that there are 3 different equally authoritative versions of Hamlet, and the to be or not to be speech in the 1604 version, the first printed version, doesn't begin with to be or not to be, that's the question. Right? Like, who decided that? Who made that decision? It begins to be or not to be, there's the point. It's a radically different speech and a radically different Hamlet that we think was a performance text. So somewhere down the line, somebody decided the to be or not to be speech that we all know and love is the to be or not to be speech. And that this traveling performance text is not worthy of our attention. And there's been real movement to kind of resuscitate those texts. In fact, in the early 20th century, an editor, he's named with the last name Gregg, edited the text and named the first quarto, the 1604 text, the bad quarto. So we've got judgment, moral judgment on the texts themselves. And I should add that there still has not been a Black editor of for the Arden series, the major Shakespearean series. The Arden 4 is about to come out, and that is changing. But who gets to decide again what the text is and what the text means is very much in flux.
I want to pick up on this last big question before my short final question before we move to audience Q&A. But when we talk about the text itself, Adele and Carla, your work tracks what happens when Shakespeare crosses borders linguistically, culturally. When Shakespeare is fully translated versus partially adapted, what do you see transform most dramatically? And what surprisingly remains legible across different cultures? Just a light, easy question.
I mean, there's several questions. um, and there's several variables. I mean, it's always different. I started, my PhD thesis on Shakespeare in Asia. My first essay that I published was on Shakespeare in Hong Kong, and even within that very specific context, right? I mean, there's a difference between Shakespeare on stage in Hong Kong, and there's a difference between Shakespeare in the cinema. I honestly, I don't know how to answer the question. There's just, I mean, the essence of the plays, always, the core message of the plays, whatever that might be, I think is there. But it's just, again, it's
just so many variables when you think about it. Carla, do you have a?
My focus has been on Latinx themed Shakespeare productions. And sometimes there are different types of dramaturgies. One can be a cultural dramaturgy, but one can also be a linguistic dramaturgy where we're playing with language. And I found that once a production hits more than 25% of the language translated into Spanish or into another language, the audience perceives it as bilingual. And so once you kind of hit that point, and yes, I've counted words and done a total word count in scripts. So one of the examples that I've given is that in Romeo and Juliet, Benvolio's first greeting to Romeo is "Good morrow, cousin," which is often translated to "Buenos dias, cousin." And Buenos dias is easier even for non-Spanish speaking audience members to understand than good morrow, right? But the word cousin, which is used more than 20 times in the play, cousin can be hombre, primo, tío, cabrón, like whatever it can be, and they actually are cousins in that sense. But the decision of how you translate cousin in that exchange could be different how you translate cousin in a different exchange. Good morrow is used just once, right? So it's a very easy kind of, and when you do that, it doesn't dumb down, but it's a way of ethnicizing and modernizing in the same moment. And it brings the audience in because I don't think that Shakespeare needs to be translated to be understood, but there are also some things where you're like, huh? And that can be a little strange. And in the cultural context, many different interpretations as well. I've seen and studied a lot of Romeo and Julietas. More than 25% of Latinx themed Shakespeare productions and adaptations are Romeo and Juliet. And I think that's because structurally, there's a lot of balance to it. There's a great deal of antithesis that's used. My only love sprung from my only hate. And that you can move between languages and there's almost a repetition because you're expressing one thought in multiple ways, maybe on both sides of the sentence. And there's also no strange subplot like we get in some other plays. And so I think that cultural translation, and when I say Latinx, I'm talking about people from more than 25 different countries, right? And different types of bilingual and multilingualism. But I think that what remains in the plays is kind of this spirit of a way of storytelling. So there's falling in love with Shakespeare's stories, and there's falling in love with the way that he tells stories. And I think that's been most fascinating when people from different cultures and backgrounds pick up his plays and interpret them, is kind of the homage they will make to that type of creativity.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I have one quick rapid fire response before I turn it over to the audience for Q&A, which is, I have here one sentence, but I'm just going to say, just give me a title. Which Shakespeare play feels most politically urgent right now, and why?
We said in the elevator all of them. We were nervous about this question. I'm going to say Merchant of Venice because it involves the circulation of capital as it's implicated in race, gender, sexuality, religion, politics. That feels really urgent, and the intermeshment of all of those issues feels urgent to me in this world.
That's great. That's great. Anyone?
I'll say The Tempest because it's a graceful model of relinquishing concentrated power and speaks to undoing the colonialist impulse.
Cool, cool, cool.
I'd probably say Measure for Measure because justice, justice, justice is said multiple times throughout that, and people think that they're in the right, but it's really about righteousness, and ultimately, well, I'll stop there.
I think Othello and The Taming of the Shrew. I'm sorry, it's two. I've narrowed it down to two.
I'll accept.
But you know, those are the ones that spark the best conversations in the classroom and have done for me for years. So those two.
That's amazing. All right. I do want to thank our panelists for helping us not just trace Shakespeare's texts, but also Shakespeare's travels across revolutions, institutions, and communities who have found these plays, language for power, for critique, and for survival. So if tonight has suggested anything, it may be that Shakespeare endures not because the plays are fixed, but because they remain remarkably available to be claimed, contested, translated, staged, and reimagined. And with that in mind, I would love to open the conversation to you. Questions on your mind, and just kindly wait for the microphone to arrive. We have another one. Amaze. I was going to give you mine. Hi.
Hi. So first of all, I grew up in a family that was involved in a lot of Shakespeare. It's been present in my life, my whole life. And I'd say the defining moment for me was coming out of the pandemic. I got to play the role of Puck in Midsummer, my favorite role of all time. And I was the only teenager in a cast of all adults. And I remember being told very early on in rehearsal by the director, "You're playing too old, play your age." And I found that so fascinating because of the age dynamic of our Oberon, especially being an older man, like in his 50s, 60s, honestly don't know, but to be able to play up that dynamic of me being the only teenager and having this greater power, and it taught me so much about the way Shakespeare is seen. So my question to all of the panelists is, because Shakespeare has a lot of defined lessons such as "to thine own self be true," what is the most important lesson that you've taken from any of Shakespeare's texts?
Love that. Love that. No pressure.
I actually quoted "To thine own self be true" to you earlier. And I have it on a pen.
I'll offer, it's almost as pithy as that. I had a teacher once say to me that there's a sonnet for every feeling, and that a sonnet a day keeps the doctor away. So I'll offer that. I think for me, it's very therapeutic sometimes just to pick up the text and say them.
I really can't narrow it down to one, but when I realized that Juliet is smarter than Romeo, it made me happy. She mentions marriage, and it takes them 9 or 11 lines to like get back to her on that, but she knows what she wants. It does not end well, so I'm not saying it's smart, right, between them, but I'd seen that role in my first festival experience. It was played as someone who didn't know what she was doing. And when I read and reread and watched and interacted and performed, I'm like, she helps change his language. He becomes part of society through marriage to her. And he says at one point when he's not challenging Tybalt back, Juliet, thou hast made me effeminate, meaning that he hasn't turned to draw and he hasn't engaged in the code duello. You know, he's not challenging back a man who has challenged him. But at the same time, he grows and learns, and his speech patterns change through his relationship with her. And I'm like, yeah, you go, girl. Again, doesn't end well, not recommending, but it changed something for me.
You know, since you brought up age and the question of age and how we encounter Shakespeare as we age, I will say that one of the most wonderful things is aging through Shakespeare, where gosh, I feel like I'm so old. I'm in midlife crisis, I guess, right? Where the lines that stood out to me when I was young aren't the ones that speak to me the most now. And I feel like you can grow into Shakespeare, and those layers come in waves as you age through it. And right, like there's something for every moment in your life. There's some way in which that poetry just gets you at every moment if you keep reading for it.
That's beautiful. Adele, is there advice that you? No pressure.
You made me think about A Midsummer Night's Dream, actually. And when I was teaching it recently, I used to identify with Hermia. But now in middle age, I identify with Titania. So, you know, age does change how you respond to what you're interested in with regard to Shakespeare, but you'll always find something there. You're evolving with, you know, with his works.
That's such a great question. I played Juliet in 3 different productions, one in college and then twice professionally. And I would say, don't put much stock in the Italian postal system. I want to be very mindful of our time. We've gone a bit over, and I want to make sure that if you do want to come up and talk to our panelists, that you have a few moments to do so. So I am going to wrap us and just say thank you so much for that thoughtful question and for all the thoughtful responses here tonight. And thank you all for being such an engaged, wonderful audience.